Hi, everybody. It's Kathleen, and you're tuning in to the Cathleen Scott podcast. Today's episode is going to try to answer a question that we've seen in the headlines, which read, Trump administration seeks list of students and faculty members who are Jewish at the University of Pennsylvania. We're going to dig into that with our fact-based and investigation approach and try to answer what the heck is going on. And then also going to peel back the onion layers a little bit and find out truth from fiction and anything that's a little bit explosive and not completely accurate. So we're not here to sell news. We're here to get to the answers. So we're going to follow our traditional fact-based approach. So let's start from the beginning. In December of 2023, there were a number of protests happening on university campuses. The protests were largely focused around the conflict in Gaza. Many of the protests were pro-Palestinian, and because of that, many felt they were also anti-Semitic. And so the question was raised, are universities doing enough to keep their students and faculty members safe in this environment? And when does free speech and protest sort of bleed over into conduct that could be illegal, unsafe, or potentially damaging to students and faculty alike, employees of the university as well? So in December of 2023, Congress called several university presidents in and questioned them about the definition of their policies and what they were doing to protect students. The University of Pennsylvania's president was one of the individuals who was called in and questioned and was asked repeatedly, what is the definition of harassment, and was asked whether or not a comment that was made, such as the seeking to exterminate all Jews, would be considered some type of harassment under the university policies. The president provided a very careful, scalpel, precise response that indicated, well, it could be, depending on the context, if that context was severe and pervasive enough, that could make it harassment. Obviously, this was something that caused the president to have pretty much a huge public outcry afterwards and ultimately caused her resignation. What's interesting, and why am I talking about this? Because I said we started off at the beginning about, is the Trump administration seeking information from the University of Pennsylvania for the list of Jewish students? But this is how we get there. We get there because 5 days after this president testified, the EEOC opened up a case, and they opened up a case against the University of Pennsylvania. They filed what's called a commission charge. We'll talk about what the significance of that is in just a minute. The EEOC, which is a federal agency, and what it does, its sole responsibility is to investigate and prosecute claims of discrimination, harassment, and retaliation for employees. And so the chairperson of the EEOC was Andrea Lewis. This is a former Gibson and Dunn attorney turned EEOC commissioner. Gibson and Dunn has a very defense-oriented labor and employment law practice. So this is a Trump-appointed individual who filed what's known as a charge. Now, let me just put a little context. I'm a labor and employment lawyer. I represent both employees and employers. I have defended and filed numerous charges, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. And so the traditional way the EEOC investigates and does their job is by having someone come to them and say, I am aggrieved, I feel discriminated, I am harassed, I feel retaliated against. And then that employee completes and files a charge. And that charge is then either investigated or mediated by the EEOC. Generally speaking, all charges are accepted. What is different here? Here, this charge wasn't filed by a member of the faculty who was complaining. It wasn't filed by an employee of the university. It wasn't filed by a student. It was filed by the commissioner herself. This is an extraordinarily rare type of filing. Yes, the EEOC has the authority to itself file a charge, but it doesn't identify any individual who's actually being harmed, discriminated, retaliated, or suffering through a hostile work environment. And then there's some other extraordinary things. I want to go ahead and read to you what this charge says, again, drafted by the EEOC chairperson. It claims that the University of Pennsylvania engaged in a pattern and practice of harassment based on national origin, religion, race against Jewish employees in violation of Title VII by subjecting Jewish faculty, which includes tenured and non-tenured, adjunct and alike, staff and other employees, and students who are employed by the university to suffer an unlawful hostile work environment based on their national origin, essentially being Jewish. Now, one of the other interesting things in this charge is it says, and listen clearly about this, the above allegations are based on publicly available information regarding the employer, but not limited to, including but not limited to, news reporting, public statements by the employer and its leadership, publicly available letters from the university board, donors, alum, and other university materials. Generally, you need evidence, and generally you need a plaintiff or a person who's harmed to file a claim. So this is very interesting. So now the EEOC basically is seeking what's called a class for all current and former Jewish faculty and staff members who continue to be or might be adversely affected by unlawful employment practices. Please note that in this charge, there is no date of any violation. There's no examples of any actual mistreatment, hostile work environment, nothing. Basically, what it says is based on news media, the EEOC commissioner is filing a charge on behalf of all Jewish faculty without their permission, without identifying a single person. So that's a very unusual thing. Why do we care? Because when the EEOC opens up a charge, it invokes its own jurisdiction. This allows it to get information. So the EEOC did just that. It sought information from the University of Pennsylvania. Now, again, as someone who practices in this space, I have defended and helped and worked with EEOC to get information from employers many times. And generally what you ask for is the policy for the employer. You ask for information about the employees who are subject to the charge. Here they claim the entire faculty. What you don't typically do is ask the employer to create a list. So I want to go through and really put up on the screen for you right now what actually was being requested. And I apologize, but I'm going to look down at my phone because I think this is critical. Okay. So as part of this EEOC charge filing, the EEOC then issues what's known as a request for information. In the request for information, they ask the university to produce, they ask for any prior complaints from November 22nd to the present for anybody who's ever complained about similar issues. They want their first and last name. They want the details, the dates of the employment of that particular employee. They want to know what happened to the investigation. That's pretty traditional. And they also want all documents and records that were ever provided to the Department of Education regarding any investigation they've done to be provided to them. And then it goes on. They want their policies. That's pretty normal. They want, and this one's a little unusual too, number 4, produce records from the University of Pennsylvania Police Department related to employee complaints of anti-Semitic conduct, harassment, discrimination occurring from November 2022 to the present. Number 5, produce a list of all clubs, groups, organization, and recreation groups related to the Jewish religion, faith, ancestry, national origin, and listen, for each organization, produce the following: the name of the organization, whether the organization is run by employees or volunteers, identify the organizational point of contact by first and last name, produce the organization's point of contact information to include phone numbers, email addresses, and mailing addresses, produce a roster of the organization's members. For each member, state whether they are a university employee or a volunteer. For employees identified on the roster, produce their last known contact information, personal phone number, email address, mailing address, and the organizational website if applicable. They also want the records to show available anybody that supports discrimination. And then there's number 7. And this is the one that's probably getting the most news attention. Produce a list of employees in the Jewish Study Program at the University of Pennsylvania Department from November 2022 to the present. For each employee listed, produce their name, position, dates of employment, location on campus, and their last known contact information, which includes their personal email addresses, phone, and mailing addresses. So this is extraordinary that they're asking the university not just to produce information that it may have, but also to know who on their campus might be Jewish, essentially. And that is something that is not traditional in terms of what we see with requests for information. So this is something very, very, very different. So understandably, the university objected as it can, and then that is what is being called the court case. And so there is a current complaint pending in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania right now, and the issue is going to be decided by the court what should be produced and what shouldn't be produced. And so I'd like to talk about the why and draw some what I think are interesting conclusions into looking into this. First of all, there is no person who's claiming discrimination or harassment. The EEOC is the driving force behind this, and that's unusual. Also, it's focused entirely on anti-Semitism. And so if the university arguing that the university is engaging in anti-Semitism, there's no similar type of action being filed for anybody else who might be offended by this speech. In particular, there's nothing being filed if anything was said that could be construed as Islamophobic or anti-Muslim. This is entirely focused on anti-Semitism. The EEOC has filed a motion asking the judge to fine the University of Pennsylvania to in contempt, similar to that, saying in order to show cause, where they haven't produced and created this list of employees and faculty and students who might be engaging in on-campus groups regarding their Jewish faith, and which they have reasonably withheld, in my opinion. So one thing I'd like to draw a couple of similarities and just kind of make some big picture takeaways. In court cases and in requests for information, it is very common for federal agencies to ask for documents. Department of Labor comes in, they ask for wage and hour documents. Sure. EEOC comes in, wants to see, let me see the personnel file for this person who's making the complaint. Sure. What is unusual is for them to ask an organization to create a list. I've never seen that in nearly 30 years of practice. And I've actually gone through my cases and compared this particular request for information and subpoena with other requests for information subpoenas that I've seen, and it is far more broad than anything that my eyes have seen in practicing in this space and being board certified as a labor and employment lawyer. So it's unusual. It's very unusual, as I've said, that there is no party making the complaint here. There's no person. This is the EEOC driving this force. And I find that to be a bit unusual. And so we asked the question, what's driving this? What's driving this? And it raises some interesting question, can individuals who think that they're attending something on campus, they're engaging in free speech, they're attending an assembly, they're going to a meeting that might be interesting to them, but if doing so means that you have to have your name, your contact information, your personal email, your personal cell phone produced, that has a stifling effect on free speech. And I think when we ask these questions as a society, we have to look at the why. Why is a federal agency pushing for this information and asking a university and going to the great lengths of filing an action for an order to show cause in federal court in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania? Why are they doing that? And so I went backwards a little bit just to try to find out, what's the history between this agency and the University of Pennsylvania and President Trump, which is what the headlines are saying. Trump is seeking this information. And I think, that there isn't any clear indication that the president himself has directed this. I think those dots are being connected because the individual who did this charge and is seeking this information is the commissioner who was appointed by President Trump. There's also been a long history of beef between the Trump administration and the University of Pennsylvania. Trump, went to school there at Wharton, and there was a lot of news coverage previously about how hard was it to get in and how did he get in, and so that's been an issue. There have been information, news reporting on the fact that Trump was angry with the university for not putting up him on the alumni news or doing a special or running information on him. We don't know the motivations for why this is happening. But I think when we sit here as a society and we say creating lists of people based on their religious beliefs, which is very troubling, we should be asking these questions and we should be looking deeper into this because this is something that affects all of us. Every citizen has the right, every employee has the right to think, to be curious, to go to organizations, to assemble, to engage in speech. And speech isn't bad speech because you disagree with it. Let's think about this. Peaceful assembly has been a fundamental issue in our country for over 200 years. And it isn't just speech that we like. It needs to include speech that we don't like, even horrific speech that we all would probably disagree with. Because when we start deciding what's good speech versus bad speech, then that is the regulation of speech in and of itself. And so I think in this context, we have to look at ourselves and ask ourselves these questions about how far are we going to allow this to go? The other concerning issue is a trend by federal agencies to investigate companies when they don't behave the way that they're supposed to or fall in line the way they're supposed to based on pressure from the federal government and perhaps from the president himself. And I think that needs to be looked at as well. And I don't know that it's a correct statement to say that President Trump is seeking lists of students who are Jewish. I think that's a little bit of an overstatement. You need the context of this case to look through it. I do think the application, when you look at what's happening in this case and you go through it, that is the end result, is that the University of Pennsylvania might be ordered by a federal judge to produce the names of students who attended various organizations. And anytime we go gathering up the names of individuals who happen to be of Jewish faith, I think we all need to be concerned and start hitting and sounding alarms. So in trying to find out what could motivate where we are now, we did our own research and found several different pressure points. One we mentioned was the congressional hearing where the university president testified about her views on free speech, which didn't seem to agree with the individuals who were asking the questions. There's also been a long history and arguments about funding, and there was a suspension of funding to the tune of $175 million in federal funding research. This funding was later restored in July of 2025 after the university reached a deal with the Department of Education to settle various civil rights allegations. There's been a lot of back and forth over transgender rights with this particular university. There's also been an opportunity for some conflict dating back to October of 2025, when the university rejected a White House proposal that would have granted federal government significant influence over the university operations. So what we see is a little bit of a pushback. Is the subpoena an example of the pressure that the federal government can apply when they don't get what they want in terms of universities falling in line and claiming academic freedom when the topics being offered are offensive to those in power? That's a question we should all be asking ourselves. I do think that it is, in conclusion, as someone who has litigated these cases, it is astonishing that any federal organization would think that they'd be entitled to personal information, names, addresses, and phone numbers of Jewish employees and students, particularly when there's no particular student who's waving a flag saying, I'm discriminated against, but the person, the tail wagging the dog here, is actually the federal government, the EEOC commissioner who filed the charge herself. And just let that sink in. The EEOC is bringing its own lawsuit, seeking its own information for its own purposes. Who stands to gain from the information sought? That's a question we all need to ask ourselves. Thank you for joining me. I'm Kathleen of the Cathleen Scott podcast. We appreciate you tuning in on this topic, and you can count on us to give you our fact-based thoughts and opinions on current events, as well as labor and employment law news. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again at the Cathleen Scott podcast.